Hey, modern fan followers, I presume you and your beloved ones are fine and dandy. It's social activist come good-hearted preacher Professor S. Suresh back with absolute ecstasy for my 116th video on unveil of publication on YouTube today, 30th November 2020, Monday. The topic for today is pragmatic recommendations to end miseries of bonded laborers and slaves. Bonded laborers are also like slaves. Not much of a difference since the human labor rights are violated by the affluent for their own benefits. Slavery and enslavement of the state and the condition of being a slave who is someone forbidden to quit the service for another person and is treated like property. Slavery relies heavily on the enslaved person being intimidated either by the threat of violence or some other method of abuse. In chattel slavery, the enslaved person is legally rendered the personal property title of the slave owner. In economics, the term de facto slavery describes the conditions of unfree labor and forced labor that most slaves endure. In the course of history, slavery was often a feature of civilization and legal in most societies, but is now outlawed in all countries of the world, except as punishment for crime. In 2019, approximately 40 million people, of whom 26% were children, were enslaved throughout the world despite it being illegal. In the modern world, more than 50% of enslaved people provide forced labor, usually in the factories and sweatshops of the private sector of a country's economy. In the industrialized countries, human trafficking is modern variety of slavery. In the unindustrialized countries, enslavement by debt bondage is a common form of enslaving a person, such as captive domestic servants, forced marriage, and child soldiers. The word slave is derived from the ethnonym, ethnic name Slav, S-L-A-V. It arrived in English via the whole French sclav, S-E-L-A-V. In medieval Latin, the word was sclavus, and in Byzantine Greek, different. Use of the word arose during the early medieval period when Slavs from Central and Eastern Europe, Sakaliba, were frequently enslaved by Moors from the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. An older interpretation connects slave to the Greek verb skylio, to strip a slain enemy. There is a dispute among historians about whether terms such as unfree laborer or enslaved person rather than slave should be used when describing the victims of slavery. According to those proposing a change in terminology, slave perpetuates the kind of slavery in language by reducing its victims to a non-human noun instead of carrying them forward as people, not the property that they were. Other historians prefer slave because the term is familiar and shorter, or because it accurately reflects the inhumanity of slavery, with the person implying a degree of autonomy that slavery does not allow. Indenture, also known as bonded laborer or debt bondage, is a form of unfree labor under which a person pledges himself or herself against a loan. The service is required to repay the debt, and the duration may be undefined. Debt bondage can be passed on from generation to generation, with the children required to pay off the progenitor's debt. It is the most widespread form of slavery today. Debt bondage is most prevalent in South Asia. As a social institution, chattel slavery, traditional slavery, denies the human agency of people by legalistically dehumanizing them into chattels, personal property owned by the slave. Therefore, slaves give birth to slaves. Children of slaves are born enslaved by way of the legalistic philosophy of partus sequita ventra, that which is brought forth follows the belly. They are also bought and sold at will as a result. Although chattel slavery was the usual form of enslavement in most societies that practiced slavery throughout history, since the 19th century, this form of slavery was formally abolished. Slavery has also been used to refer to a legal state of dependency to someone else. Forced labor or unfree labor is sometimes used to describe an individual who is forced to work against their own will under threat of violence or other punishment, as I said before. But the generic term unfree labor is also used to describe chattel slavery, as well as any other situation in which a person is obliged to work against their own will and a person's ability to work productively is under the complete control of another person. This may also include institutions not commonly classified as slavery, such as serfdom, conscription, and penal labor. While some unfree labor, such as serfs, have a substantive, de jure, legal, and traditional rights, they also have no ability to terminate the arrangements under which they work and are frequently subject to forms of coercion, violence, and restrictions on their activities and movement outside their place of work. Human trafficking primarily involves women and children forced into prostitution and are the fastest growing form of forced labor, with Thailand, Cambodia, India, Brazil, and Mexico having been identified as leading hotspots of commercial sexual exploitation of children. Examples of sexual slavery, often in military contexts, include detention in rape camps or comfort stations, comfort women, forced marriages to soldiers, and the other practices involving the treatment of women or men as chattel, and as such, violations of the pre-emptory norm prohibiting slavery. In 2007, Human Rights Watch estimated that 200,000 to 300,000 children served as soldiers in current conflicts. Even militia groups, more girls under 16 work as domestic workers than any other category of child labor, often sent to the cities by parents living in rural poverty, such as in Restavix in Haiti. Forced marriages or early marriages are often considered types of slavery. Forced marriage continues to be practiced in parts of the world, including some parts of Asia and Africa, and in immigrant communities in the West. Sacred prostitution is where girls and women are pledged to priests or those of higher caste, such as the practice of Devadasi in South Asia or fetish slaves in West Africa. Marriage by abduction occurs in many places in the world today, with a national average of 69% of marriages in Ethiopia being through abduction. Slavery is more common when the labor done is relatively simple and thus easy to supervise, such as large-scale growing of a single crop like sugar and cotton, in which output was based on economics of scale. This enabled such systems of labor, such as the gang system in the US, to become prominent on large plantations where field hands were monitored and worked with factory-like precision. Since the 18th century, critics have argued that slavery tends to retard technological advancement because the focus is on increasing the number of slaves doing simple tasks rather than upgrading the efficiency of labor. Scottish economist Adam Smith states that free labor was economically better than slave labor and that it is nearly impossible to end slavery in a free, democratic, or republican form of government, since many of its legislators or political figures are slave owners and would not punish them. He further states that slaves would be better able to gain their freedom when there was a centralized government or a central authority like a king of the such. Worldwide, slavery is a criminal offense, but slave owners can get very high returns for the risk. According to researchers Siddharth Kara, the profits generated worldwide by all forms of slavery in 2007 were 91.2 billion US dollars. This is second only to drug trafficking in terms of global criminal enterprises. Approximately 40% of slave profits each year are generated by trafficked sex slaves, representing slightly more than 4% of the world's 29 million slaves. Throughout history, slaves were clothed in a distinctive fashion, particularly with respect to the frequent lack of footwear, as they were commonly forced to go barefoot. This was partly because of economic reasons, but also served as a distinguishing feature, especially in South Africa and South America. According to the Bible, shoes have been considered as badges of freedom since antiquity. Another widespread practice was branding the slaves either to generally mark them as property or as punishment, usually reserved for fugitives. The earliest known record, slavery is treated as an established institution. The Code of Hammurabi, 1760 BC, for example, prescribed death for anyone who helped a slave escape or who sheltered a fugitive. The Bible mentions slavery as an established institution. How could they say that? holy this thing. Slavery was known in almost every ancient civilization and society. Such institutions included death, bondage, punishment for crime, the enslavement of prisoners of war, child abandonment, and the birth of slave children to slaves. Slavery was practiced in many different forms. Debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, and criminal slavery were all practiced in various parts of Africa. Slavery has existed all through Asia, and forms of slavery still exist today. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa. Slavery has existed all throughout Asia, and forms of slavery still exist today. Slavery in India was widespread by the 6th century BC and perhaps even as far back as the Vedic period. Slavery intensified during the Muslim domination of northern India after the 11th century. Slavery existed in Portuguese India after the 16th century. The Dutch too largely dealt in Abyssinian slaves known in India as Hatshis or Shidis. Arakan, Bengal, Malabar, and Coromandel remained the largest sources of forced labor until the 1660s. Between 1626 and 1662, the Dutch exported on an average 150 to 400 slaves annually from the Arakan Bengal coast. During the first 30 years of Batavia's existence, Indian and Arakanese slaves provided the main labor force of the Dutch East India Company, Asian headquarters. An increase in Coromandel slaves occurred during a famine following the revolt of the Nayaka Indian rulers of South India, Tanjore, Senji, and Madurai against Bijapur overlordship, 1645, and the subsequent devastation of the Tanjore countryside by the Bijapur army. Reportedly, more than 150,000 people were taken by the invading Deccan Muslim armies to Bijapur and Gurkha. In 1646, 2,118 slaves were exported to Batavia, the overwhelming majority from southern Coromandel. Some slaves are also acquired further south of Atundi, Adirampatnam, and Kayalpatnam. Another increase in slaving took place between 1659 and 1661 from Tanjore as a result of a series of successive Bijapuri raids. At Nagapatnam, Pulicat, and elsewhere, the company purchased 8,000 to 10,000 slaves, the bulk of whom were sent to Ceylon, while a small portion were exported to Batavia and Malacca. Finally, following a long drought in Madurai and southern Coromandel, in 1673, which intensified the prolonged Madurai Maratha struggle over Tanjore and punitive fiscal practices. Thousands of people from Tanjore, mostly children, were sold into slavery and exported by Asian traders from Nagapattinam to Ase, Johar, and other slave markets. Slave markets in 16 in Tamil we call them what is it? Kottadimik. Okay, in September 1687, 665 slaves were exported by the English from Fort St. George, Madras. And in 1694-96, when warfare once more ravaged South India, a total of 3,859 slaves were imported from Coromandel by private individuals into Ceylon. The volume of the total Dutch-Indian Ocean slave trade has been estimated to be about 15 to 30% of the Atlantic slave trade, slightly smaller than the trans-Saharan slave trade, and 1.5 to 3 times the size of the Swahili and Red Sea coast and the Dutch West India Company slave trades. In medieval times, you know about gladiator system. There was a movie also in English, Gladiators. These slaves need to fight. They need to kill one another, and people will bet on them and enjoy. It was a sport. How can you call it as a sport? Damn it! According to Sir Henry Bartle-Frere, who sat on the Viceroy's Council, there were an estimated 8 or 9 million slaves in India in 1841. About 15% of the population of Malabar were slaves. Slavery was legally abolished in the possessions of the East India Company by the Indian Slavery Act 1843. Depending upon the era in the country, slaves sometimes had a limited set of legal rights. Even though slavery is now outlawed in every country, that's what they say. The number of slaves today is estimated at between 12 million and 29.8 million. According to a broad definition of slavery, there are about 27 million people in slavery in 1999, spread all over the world. In 2005, the International Labour Organization (ILO) provided an estimate of 12.3 million forced laborers, that is slaves. Siddharth Kara has also provided an estimate of 28.4 million slaves at the end of 2006, divided into three categories: bonded labor, debt bondage 18.1 million, forced labor 7.6 million, and trafficked slaves 2.7 million. Kara provides a dynamic model to calculate the number of slaves in the world each year, with an estimated 29.2 million at the end of 2009. According to a 2003 report by Human Rights Watch, an estimated 15 million children in debt bondage in India work in slavery-like conditions to pay off the family's debts. A report by the Walk Free Foundation in 2013 found India had the highest number of slaves, nearly 14 million, followed by China 2.9 million, Pakistan 2.1 million. Nigeria, Ethiopia, Russia, Thailand, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, and Bangladesh were the countries with the highest proportions of slaves were Mauritania, Haiti, Pakistan, India, and Nepal. In June 2013, U.S. State Department released a report on slavery. It placed Russia, China, and Uzbekistan in the worst offenders category. Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Syria, and Zimbabwe are at the lowest level. The list also included Algeria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, among a total of 21 countries. The Walk Free Foundation reported in 2018 that slavery in wealthy Western societies is much more prevalent than previously known. In particular, the US and UK, which have 403,000, 1 in 800, and 136,000 slaves respectively. Andrew Farr, founder of the organization, said that the US is one of the most advanced countries in the world, yet has more than 400,000 modern slaves working under forced labor conditions. An estimated 40.3 million are enslaved globally, with North Korea having the most slaves at 2.6 million, 1 in 10. The foundation defines contemporary slavery as situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power, or deception. Victims of human trafficking are typically recruited through deceit or trickery, such as false job offer, false migration offer, or false marriage offer, sale by family members, recruitment by former slaves, or outright abduction. Yeah, the sheikhs, the rich sheikhs from the Middle East, they buy the young girls and marry them forcibly and treat them. I want to use some word. Treat them like trash. Victims are forced into a dead salary situation by coercion, deception, fraud, intimidation, isolation, threat, physical force, debt bondage, or even force feeding with the drugs to control their victims. Annually, according to US government-sponsored research completed in 2006, approximately 800,000 people are trafficked across national borders, which does not include millions trafficked within their own countries. Approximately 80% of transnational victims are women and girls. And up to 50% are minors, reports the US State Department in a 2008 study. But the majority of trafficking victims are women who are forced into prostitution, in which case the practice is called sex trafficking. Victims also include men, women, and children who are forced into manual labor. Because of the illegal nature of human trafficking, its extent is unknown. Even for organ harvesting, also they use the traffic victims. They traffic the victims. The US government report published in 2005 estimates that about 700,000 people worldwide are trafficked across borders each year. This figure does not include those who are trafficked internally. Another research effort revealed that roughly 1.5 million individuals are trafficked either internally or internationally every year, of which about 500,000 are sex trafficking victims. In 1839, the world's oldest international human rights organization, Anti-Slavery International, was formed in Britain by Joseph Sturge, which campaigned to outlaw slavery in other countries. There were celebrations in 2007 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the sex slave trade in the UK through the work of the British Anti-Slavery Society. In the 1860s, David Livingstone's reports of atrocities within the Arab Slave trade in Africa stirred up in the interest of the British public, reviving the flagging abolitionist movement. Royal Navy throughout the 1870s attempted to suppress this abominable eastern trade at Zanzibar in particular. In 1905, the French abolished indigenous slavery in most parts of the French West Africa. On December 10, 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declared freedom from slavery is an internationally recognized human right. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, "No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms." In 2014, for the first time in history, major leaders of many religions, Buddhist, Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim, met to sign a shared commitment against modern-day slavery. The declaration they signed calls for the elimination of slavery and human trafficking by 2020. The signatories are Pope Francis, Mata Amritanandamayi, Datuk Sri Damatana, Chief High Priest of Malaysia, Rabbi Abraham, Rabbi David Abbas Abdullah Abbas Saliman, and the Secretary of State of Al Azhar Al Sharif, Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Al Morresi, Sheikh Nazia Razak Jafar, Special Advisor of Grand Ayatollah Sheikh Omar Aboud, Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury and Metropolitan Emmanuel of France, groups such as the American Anti-Slavery Group, Anti-Slavery International, Free the Slaves, the Anti-Slavery Society, and the Norwegian Anti-Slavery Society continue to campaign to eliminate slavery. There have been movements to achieve reparations for those families held as slaves or for their descendants. Claims for reparations for being held in slavery are handled as a civil law matter. It will be handled under criminal law, actually, in almost every country. This is often described as a serious problem, since former slaves' relatives' lack of money means that they often have limited access to a potentially expensive and futile legal process. They are suffering for a square meal a day. How can they initiate the legal process? Mandatory systems of fines and reparations paid to an as yet undetermined group of claimants from fines paid by unspecified parties and collected by authorities have been proposed by advocates to alleviate the civil code problem. Since in almost all cases there are no living ex-slaves or living ex-slave owners, these movements have gained little traction. In nearly all cases, the judicial system has ruled that the state statute of limitations on these possible claims has long since expired. The word slavery is often used as a pejorative to describe any activity in which one is coerced into performing. Some argue that military drafts and other forms of coerced government labor constitute state-operated slavery. Some libertarians and anarcho-capitalists view government taxation as a form of slavery. Slavery has been used by some anti-psychiatry proponents to define involuntary psychiatric patients, claiming there are no unbiased physical tests for mental illness, and yet the psychiatric patient must follow the orders of the psychiatrist. They assert that instead of chains to control the slave, the psychiatrist uses drugs to control the mind. Drapetomania was a psychiatric diagnosis for a slave who did not want to be a slave. Some proponents of animal rights have applied this term slavery to the condition of some or all human-owned animals, arguing that the status is comparable to that of human slaves. Why worry about the animals? First, worry about the human beings. Idiots. The labor market as institutionalized under today's market economic system has been criticized by mainstream socialists and by anarcho syndicalists who utilize the term wage slavery as a pejorative dysphemism for wage labor. Socialists draw parallels between the trade of labor as a commodity and slavery. Cicero is also known to have suggested such parallels. Peonage, also known as debt slavery or bonded labor, is a pledge of a person's services as a security for the repayment of debt or other obligation. But the terms of the repayment are not clearly or reasonably stated, and the person who is holding the debt thus has some control over the laborer. I don't know how many of you saw a Tamil movie. Director is Bala Paradesi. So pathetic. If you are a human, definitely you'll cry if you can understand the language. Freedom is assumed on debt repayment. The services required to repay the debt may be undefined, and the services duration may be undefined, thus allowing the person supposedly own the debt to demand services indefinitely. Debt bondage can be passed on from generation to generation. Currently, debt bondage is the most common method of enslavement, with an estimated 8.1 million people bonded to labor illegally, as cited by the ILO in 2005. Debt bondage has been described by the United Nations as a form of modern-day slavery, and the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery seeks to abolish the practice. The practice is still prevalent primarily in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, although most countries in these regions are parties to the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery. It is predicted that 84 to 88% of bonded laborers in the world are in South Asia. Lack of prosecution or insufficient punishment of this crime are the leading causes of this practice as it exists at this scale today. Though the Forced Labor Convention of 1930 by the ILO, which included 187 parties, sought to bring organized attention to eradicating slavery through forms of forced labor, formal opposition to debt bondage in particular came as the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery in 1956. The convention in 1956 defined debt bondage under Article 1, Section A. Debt bondage, that is to say, the status or condition arising from a pledge by a debtor of his personal services or of those of a person under his control as security for a debt, if the value of those services are reasonably assessed, is not applied towards a liquidation of the debt, or the length and nature of those services are not respectively limited and defined. When a pledge to provide services to pay off debt is made up by an individual, the employer often illegally inflates interest rates at an unreasonable amount, making it impossible for the individual to leave bonded labor. This is what they show in the Tamil movie I said. When the bonded laborer dies, debts are often passed on to the children. The kafala system, also spent kafala system, meaning sponsorship system, is a system used to monitor migrant laborers by working primarily in the construction and domestic sectors in Gulf Cooperation Council member states and a few neighboring countries, namely Bahrain. All of you know the world's biggest tower. What is it? Burj Khalifa in Dubai, in UAE. Okay. They constructed the building with the help of bonded laborers only. So many bonded laborers died. The system requires all unskilled laborers to have an in-country sponsor, usually the employer who is responsible for the visa and legal status. This practice has been criticized by human rights organizations for creating easy opportunities for the exploitation of workers, as many employers take away passports and abuse the workers with little chance of legal repercussions. According to the economists, the migrant workers' lot is unlikely to improve until the reform of the kafala system, whereby workers are beholden to the employers who sponsor the visas. The system blocks domestic competition for overseas workers in the Gulf countries. In Islamic adoptional jurisprudence, kafala refers to the adoption of children. The original Islamic law of kafala was expanded to include a system of fixed-term sponsorship of migrant workers in several countries in the late 20th century. The first decades of the 21st century, the migrant worker system became widely referred to in English as a kafala system. The consequences of abolition after 1976 under the Act of 1976 in India are all the bonded laborers are freed and discharged from all their obligations to render the bonded labor. All the customs, traditions, contracts, agreements, or any instruments by virtue of which a person or any member of the family is required to render bonded labor to someone will now be deemed as void. Every obligation of a bonded laborer to repay any bonded debt shall be deemed to be extinguished. All the decrees for recovery of bonded labor debt which was not fully satisfied shall be deemed as fully satisfied after the commencement of the act. Every property of a bonded laborer which was removed from his possession or forcible taken from him shall be restored to him. Every bonded laborer who has been detained in civil person shall be released. Freed bonded laborers shall not be evicted from their homestead. There are several factors which are causing the continuance of this system of forced labor. Often the usurious rate of interest is one of the leading factors which contribute to its continuance. Apart from that, faulty system of adjustment of wages and the amount lent, prevalent ignorance, illiteracy, being socially backward, lack of debtors, organization, etc., are all factors contributing to the continuance of bonded labor. The system of bonded labor is an agreement between two parties, an agreement which in today's date stands void in the eyes of law and is also punishable offence under numerous legislations of India. Due to the gravity of this offence, it has also been addressed in numerous international conventions. Bonded labor is probably the least known form of slavery in today's date, and yet, ironically, excuse me, it is most widely performed form of slavery. There have been several initiatives by the National Human Rights Commission to curb this practice. Apart from that, even the Supreme Court has condemned this practice in India and has given it an expansive meaning so that it is not practiced in any form whatsoever. But is this enough? No. We must take steps against any system of forced labor and should voice out if a person is being oppressed due to his status, his or her status. This is a system which degrades a human to a commodity or an asset. It should not only be prohibited by law and also be seriously punished. Thus, forced labor, whatever form it may be, should not be condemned by anyone. There should be good plans for rehabilitation of bonded laborers. It should be condemned by. Okay. There should be good plans for rehabilitation of bonded laborers once they are free. Jails have a system of teaching some craft work like tailoring, carpentry, electrical work, baking, etc. to the inmates. Similar training could be given for these bonded laborers, not only by bonded laborers, even the third genders. Children from such families should be educated. Free medical aid should be provided besides free housing, food and clothes. Basically, teaching such people new skills would enable them to be self-reliant in the long run. Improve their financial status in all possible ways since poverty is the root cause of all these evils in society. Eradicate poverty and this world would be a better place to live. Stop all forms of exploitation and make punishment more severe for the perpetrators. This I kept saying, but it is not happening. Eye for an eye is the right policy. Debates, discussion on open-ended topics like this can go on forever. Anyhow, let me pull the plug here. We'll meet again real soon with another interesting topic. Some of the statements used expressed are solely mine based on limited knowledge gained over 6 decades of versatile experience. Always watch these videos with a closed caption, subtitles for absolute 100% comprehension as per my sincere recommendation zillion times so far. I know I rushed through to complete the presentation in 20 minutes max. That's a norm that I had set myself to retain the viewer's attention. But at the same time, I know pretty well that I'm exceeding that time. I take double the time, sometimes even triple the time based on the topic and the coverage. I normally try to do justice for the topic I have taken, referring so many articles published recently, especially Wikipedia quite extensively, and also other articles and books published recently. Besides, of course, I sprinkle my own salt and pepper and season it with my personal experiences in my so far in my life and also intuition. Stay at home as much as possible to maintain social distancing attributed to pandemic novel COVID-19 and prolong your lifespan. Lead a healthy life. God alone can put a stop to natural, unnatural events, maybe bio and cyber or events like pandemics, which may lead to apocalypse and extinction of all sentient species on Earth for no fault of others. Rest in peace and harmony. Today I managed to complete in 34 minutes. Yay!